In 35 years as a director of nursing at Chicago General, I learned one absolute truth. The monitors always warn you before the heart stops. A slight drop in blood pressure, a flutter in the rhythm. There are always symptoms before the collapse. You just have to know how to read the chart. I spent my life catching those symptoms in strangers. I could smell a necrotic wound from down the hall. I could look at a resident's pale face and know they were bleeding internally. But when you retire, you stop looking for the signs. You let your guard down. I didn't smell the rot in my own home until the foundation was already crumbling beneath my feet. It started on a Tuesday in early October. The house I had spent 30 years paying off felt a little too quiet these days. My daughter, Chloe, was working double shifts in the ER, chasing the same nursing career I had built, but wearing herself down to the bone in the process. Her husband, Julian, was a commercial real estate broker. Julian was the kind of man who wore $1,000 suits, but somehow always forgot his wallet when the dinner check arrived. That morning, I was pouring my first cup of dark roast coffee in the kitchen. Julian was leaning against the granite counter, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, not looking up from his phone. "Eleanor, you left the porch light on again last night," he said, his tone smooth but subtly patronizing. "You really need to start double-checking these things. Electricity isn't getting any cheaper, and you know how your memory has been slipping lately." My knuckles tightened around the coffee pot just a fraction. "My memory is perfectly fine, Julian," I replied, keeping my voice calm and authoritative. "And I left the light on because Chloe texted me she was picking up an extra shift. I wanted the driveway lit for her when she got back." He chuckled softly, finally looking up with a disarming, insincere smile. "Right, of course. Just looking out for you, Mama E. At your age, living in this big house all alone? It's a lot to manage. You know, I have a client who just sold a beautiful, low-maintenance condo down in Oak Park. Perfect for retirees." He was always doing that, planting little seeds of doubt, suggesting I was too old, too fragile, too forgetful to manage my own life. I brushed it off as the arrogance of a young man who thought he knew better than a woman who had managed a $50 million hospital budget. I didn't know those little comments weren't just arrogance. They were the groundwork for a hostile takeover. The first real symptom appeared 3 hours later. I had gone to the pharmacy to pick up my routine blood pressure medication, something I had done on the second Tuesday of the month for 5 years. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance," the young pharmacist said, looking at her computer screen with a confused, apologetic expression. "It looks like the system is kicking your Medicare Part D card back. It says your coverage has been temporarily suspended due to a returned mail flag. Did you recently move?" I frowned, adjusting my glasses. "Move? I've lived at the same address on Elmwood Drive since 1994, Sarah. Run it again. It must be a glitch in the Epic system." She typed rapidly and shook her head. "I ran it twice, Mrs. Vance. The primary mailing address on your federal file was updated 3 weeks ago. It's no longer Elmwood Drive. All your medical statements and billing are being routed to a P.O. box in the South Loop." A P.O. box in the South Loop. Julian's brokerage firm was in the South Loop. When you work in hospital administration, you understand that mistakes happen. Papers get misfiled. Data gets entered incorrectly. But federal Medicare addresses do not magically change themselves to P.O. boxes in the exact zip code where your son-in-law works. I didn't argue with the pharmacist. I didn't cause a scene. I paid the $94 out of pocket in cash, took my receipt, and walked out to my car. My hands weren't shaking. My mind was already transitioning from a retired grandmother back into the director of nursing. I had a patient coding, and that patient was my own life. I drove straight home, locked the door, and went into my home office. Julian and Chloe weren't due back until evening. I had 6 hours of uninterrupted quiet. I booted up my laptop and logged into my secure Medicare portal. I knew the bureaucratic maze better than anyone. It took me 45 minutes on hold with a federal representative, navigating 3 different security checkpoints to get to the document that changed the address. "Yes, Mrs. Vance," the federal representative's tinny voice crackled over the phone. The address change was submitted physically via a change of circumstance form, accompanied by a legally binding medical power of attorney. The documents were verified and stamped by a notary on September 12th. "A medical power of attorney," I repeated, my voice dangerously low but perfectly controlled. "And who exactly is listed as the primary agent on that document?" "It lists your son-in-law, Julian Hayes. Ma'am, the file notes indicate that this POA was enacted due to— I'm sorry to read this, but it cites a recent diagnosis of cognitive decline. Are you calling with an authorized caregiver present? Cognitive decline. Julian hadn't just changed my mail. He hadn't just forged my signature on a federal document. He was legally laying the groundwork to declare me mentally incompetent. He was stripping away my autonomy, piece by piece, document by document, turning me into a ghost in my own life. I hung up the phone. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a trap waiting to spring. I looked at the scanned document on my screen. The signature read, Eleanor Vance, but it was a forgery. Julian thought I was just a tired old woman who wouldn't notice a few missing pieces of mail. He made a fatal miscalculation. He forgot that before I was a grandmother, I was an administrator. I built systems for a living, and I knew exactly how to dismantle them. The rest of that Tuesday afternoon was a masterclass in compartmentalization. In my 35 years of nursing, I had held the hands of grieving mothers and calmly directed trauma teams while my own heart pounded against my ribs. You learn to put your panic in a box, lock it tight, and focus entirely on the procedure at hand. My new procedure was dismantling my son-in-law's life before he could dismantle mine. Julian and Chloe kept their lives and their secrets in the converted guest bedroom at the end of the hall. Julian had insisted on installing a heavy-duty deadbolt on the door when he moved his home office in. He told Chloe it was to protect sensitive client information from his commercial real estate deals. But as I stood before that locked door, the wood smooth and unyielding under my palm, I knew it wasn't designed to keep clients safe. It was designed to keep me out. Unfortunately for Julian, a standard quickset deadbolt is nothing compared to the narcotics cabinets I used to secure during the night shifts in the late 80s. And people who think they are smarter than everyone else usually make the most predictable mistakes. I walked into the kitchen, reached into the decorative ceramic jar where Chloe kept the spare keys to her car, and dug past the loose change. My fingers brushed against a small, jagged piece of brass taped to the underside of the lid. Arrogance is always a predator's weakest point. I slipped the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. Stepping into Julian's office felt like crossing enemy lines. The air smelled faintly of his expensive cologne and stale coffee. The room was meticulously organized. A large mahogany desk dominated the space, flanked by filing cabinets. His laptop was gone. He always took it with him to his firm in the South Loop, but I wasn't looking for digital footprints. Digital trails can be wiped. Paper, however, requires effort to destroy, and white-collar criminals always keep physical backups of their most important lies. I put on a pair of thin latex gloves I kept in my first aid kit. If he was meticulous enough to forge my signature on federal documents, he might be paranoid enough to check for fingerprints. I started with the filing cabinets. The top two drawers were exactly what they claimed to be: boring, legitimate commercial leases and tax returns. But the bottom drawer was locked. I grabbed a simple paperclip from his desk, straightened it out, and applied the same tension technique a maintenance worker taught me decades ago when I locked myself out of the supply closet. The flimsy lock gave way in less than a minute. I pulled the drawer open. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of blank printer paper, was a thick blue legal-sized folder. There was no client name on the tab, just a date, September 30th, 3 weeks from now. I carried the folder to his desk, turned on the small brass reading lamp, and opened it. The first document was a psychiatric evaluation, printed on letterhead from a clinic I didn't recognize. I scanned the text, my eyes jumping over the medical jargon. Patient exhibits severe memory lapses, disorientation regarding time and place, agitation and paranoia consistent with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. My breath caught in my throat. I read the name at the bottom of the page. The diagnosis was signed by a Dr. Valerie Sterling, a board-certified psychiatrist. I had never met this woman in my life, yet here she was, officially declaring my brain a wasteland, stamping my future with a clinical death sentence. But why? What was the end game? I flipped past the medical lies and found the financial truth. It was a prospectus for a commercial real estate acquisition. Julian wasn't drowning in gambling debts or buying sports cars. He was trying to execute a leveraged buyout of a failing luxury-assisted living facility called Whispering Pines, located just outside the city limits. It was a multi-million-dollar deal, and he was the lead investor. But according to the highlighted margins on the bank sheets, his financing had fallen through. He was short by nearly $800,000. I looked at the next document, and the blood in my veins turned to ice water. It was a quitclaim deed transferring the ownership of my home, the house I and my late husband had worked 3 decades to own outright, into a newly formed LLC controlled entirely by Julian. Attached to it was a loan application, using my house as the primary collateral to secure the missing funds for Whispering Pines. But the final piece of the puzzle was the most chilling. It was a pre-drafted admission form for Whispering Pines Assisted Living. The patient name was Eleanor Vance. I sat back in his expensive leather chair, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a physical weight. The sheer, calculating evil of his plan was breathtaking. Julian wasn't just going to steal my house to fund his failing business venture. He was going to use his fraudulent medical power of attorney to force me out of my own home and lock me inside the very facility he was purchasing. He would be my landlord, my financial guardian, and my jailer. If I tried to tell anyone what he had done, they would just look at Dr. Valerie Sterling's forged evaluation and shake their heads in pity at the poor, delusional old woman. He was going to bury me alive in plain sight. Suddenly, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway shattered the silence. I froze. I glanced at the digital clock on Julian's desk. It was barely 2 p.m. Julian never came home this early. The heavy thud of a car door closing echoed through the walls. He was here. My heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. A code blue in my own chest. I had less than 60 seconds. I swiftly restacked the documents, ensuring their edges aligned perfectly, just the way I had found them. I slid the blue folder back into the bottom drawer, covered it with the blank paper, and pushed the drawer shut until the flimsy lock clicked back into place. I stripped off the latex gloves, shoved them into my pocket, and practically glided out of the room, my rubber-soled nursing shoes making zero sound on the hardwood floor. I pulled the door shut, locking the deadbolt behind me, and rushed into the kitchen to drop the spare key back into the ceramic jar, right as I heard the heavy clatter of Julian's keys in the front door. I grabbed a dish towel and was casually wiping down the spotless granite counter when he walked into the kitchen, loosening his silk tie, looking irritated. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me. "Eleanor," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly, scanning my face for any sign of panic. "You're home early from your errands." "Just picked up my prescription and came straight back," I lied smoothly, offering him a warm, vacant smile. "You're home early yourself, Julian. Rough day at the office?" He stared at me for a long, agonizing second. I kept my face an unreadable mask. Finally, he let out a short, dismissive sigh. "Just some paperwork I forgot," he muttered, turning toward the hallway that led to his office. "I need some quiet to review a big contract." "Take your time," I called after him, my voice pleasant and utterly harmless. I was just about to take a nap anyway. My memory might be slipping, but my bones definitely know they're 63. He didn't reply, just disappeared down the hall. I listened to the heavy metallic click of his deadbolt sliding into place. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty hallway, the dish towel gripped so tightly in my hands my knuckles ached. He thought he had outsmarted a tired old woman. He had no idea he had just declared war on a director of nursing. And I was about to call in my own specialists to start the amputation. If you want to survive a highly infectious disease, the first step is quarantine. You isolate the pathogen. You don't alert the virus that the antibodies are coming. You quietly build up your defenses until the body is ready to purge the infection entirely. Julian was a parasite feeding off my family's foundation, and I knew that if I confronted him now, with just a few photos taken on my phone and a gut full of rage, he would adapt. He would destroy the paper trail, manipulate my daughter Chloe, and accelerate his timeline. I needed a surgeon who specialized in this particular type of cancer. The next morning, after Julian left for his brokerage firm and Chloe dropped my granddaughter Nia off at school, I drove to a neighborhood 3 zip codes away. I didn't use my cell phone inside my house or my car. I walked into an old independent coffee shop on the south side, ordered a black tea, and used their public Wi-Fi on a newly purchased prepaid phone to make the call. "Desmond Wright, attorney at law," a deep, gravelly voice answered on the second ring. Desmond and I went back 20 years. Before he transitioned into elder law and estate planning, he was the lead risk management counsel for Chicago General. We had spent hundreds of hours in windowless boardrooms together, defending the hospital from frivolous malpractice suits and navigating the ethical minefields of healthcare administration. He knew how I operated, and I knew he was as ruthless as a scalpel when he needed to be. "Desmond?" I said, keeping my voice low over the hum of the coffee shop's espresso machine. "It's Eleanor Vance. I need an emergency consultation. Off the books, and I need it in 30 minutes. There was a brief pause on the line. Desmond knew I wasn't a woman prone to exaggeration. "My office is clear, Eleanor. Come through the back entrance." 35 minutes later, I was sitting across from Desmond in his mahogany-paneled office. I laid my prepaid phone on the desk and swiped through the photographs I had hurriedly snapped of Julian's files the day before. The forged medical power of attorney, the fake psychiatric evaluation signed by Dr. Valerie Sterling, the leveraged buyout prospectus for Whispering Pines, and the quitclaim deed for my house. Desmond adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his jaw tightening with every swipe. He didn't interrupt. He just absorbed the data, his legal mind analyzing the structural integrity of Julian's trap. When he finally looked up, his eyes were cold and sharp. "This isn't just elder abuse, Eleanor," Desmond said, his voice a low rumble of restrained anger. "This is a meticulously orchestrated federal crime. Wire fraud, bank fraud, and healthcare fraud, all wrapped up in a neat little bow. If he files that quitclaim deed and secures that commercial loan using a fraudulent POA and a fabricated medical diagnosis, he's looking at a decade in federal prison." "I don't just want him in prison, Desmond," I replied, leaning forward, my hands folded calmly on my lap. "I want him surgically removed from my daughter's life. If I just file a revocation of the power of attorney right now, Julian gets a notification. He'll panic. He might flee, or worse, he might try to take Chloe and Nia down with him to leverage his way out. We need to contain him." Desmond leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a gold pen against his desk. "To contain him, we have to let him believe the trap is still working. We secretly revoke the POA today, effectively neutralizing his legal authority over your assets. I will personally file the revocation with the county and flag your social security number for identity theft. The banks will freeze any transfer over $500, but—" He paused, locking eyes with me. "We don't tell him. We let him walk into the bank," I finished his thought, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. "Exactly," Desmond nodded. "We build a legal firewall around your assets, but to get the federal authorities involved, to make sure the FBI takes this case and puts him away for good, we need him to attempt to execute the fraud. We need him to step over the tripwire." "And what about this Dr. Valerie Sterling?" I asked, pointing to the screen. "A board-certified psychiatrist doesn't just hand out fake Alzheimer's diagnoses for free." "I'll run a background check on Dr. Sterling immediately," Desmond said, writing the name down on a legal pad. "My guess? She's a partner in this Whispering Pines venture. They need a medical director for the facility, and Julian needs a doctor with loose morals to sign off on his fraudulent POAs. They're a team." The plan was set. Desmond would handle the invisible legal armor, protecting my house and my money without tripping Julian's alarms. My job was infinitely more dangerous. I had to go back into that house and play the exact role Julian had written for me. I had to become the tragic, declining, forgetful old woman. I had to feed his ego and lower his guard, all while secretly gathering the audio evidence we needed to prove coercion and intent. I left Desmond's office feeling a profound sense of clarity. The shock had burned away, leaving only cold administrative resolve. When I returned home that evening, the performance began. Julian was in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of expensive bourbon that I had bought for my late husband. Chloe was at the stove, still wearing her dark blue ER scrubs, looking exhausted as she stirred a pot of soup. My 7-year-old granddaughter, Nia, was at the kitchen island, coloring quietly. I walked in, deliberately leaving my keys in the front door lock. I stepped into the kitchen, looking around with a perfectly manufactured expression of mild confusion. I let my shoulders slump just a fraction. I softened the sharp, analytical focus in my eyes, replacing it with a hazy, tired vulnerability. "Mama?" Chloe asked, turning away from the stove, her brow furrowing with concern. "Are you okay? You look pale." "Oh, I'm fine, baby," I said, letting a slight tremor enter my voice. I walked over to the cabinet, opened it, and stared blankly at the neat rows of coffee mugs. I went to the grocery store, but I can't seem to remember if I bought milk, and then I couldn't remember where I parked the car." I saw Julian out of the corner of my eye. He took a sip of his bourbon, turning away to hide a small, victorious smirk. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to slap the glass out of his hand. "You didn't go to the grocery store, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice dripping with that same faux gentle, patronizing tone. "You went to the pharmacy, remember? You were complaining about it this morning." "Did I?" I murmured, raising a trembling hand to my forehead. "Lord, my mind is just... It's like a sieve lately. I don't know what's wrong with me. I feel so tired, Julian." "It's okay, Mama E," Julian said, stepping forward and placing a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder. His touch made my skin crawl, but I leaned into it, playing the grateful victim. "You've worked hard your whole life. Maybe it's time you start letting me handle the heavy lifting. You shouldn't have to worry about bills and addresses and groceries anymore. You just need to rest." "Maybe you're right," I whispered, looking down at the floor. I slipped my hand into my cardigan pocket. My fingers brushed against the small, voice-activated digital recorder I had purchased on the way home from Desmond's office. I pressed the record button, feeling the tiny tactile click. "I'm just so glad you're here to help us, Julian," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I don't know what I would do without you." "Don't worry about a thing," Julian replied smoothly, unaware that every word he spoke was now being captured, catalogued, and filed away for his impending destruction. "I'm going to take care of everything, I promise." The quarantine was officially established. The parasite thought he was winning, but he had no idea he was already bleeding out. For 3 agonizing weeks, I played the ghost in my own home. I let my shoulders droop. I asked the same questions twice over dinner. I let Julian patronize me, gently steering me away from my own mail and managing my confusing bills, while my hidden digital recorder captured every condescending, manipulative word. But the hardest part wasn't fooling the predator. The hardest part was deceiving my own daughter. Chloe looked at me with such profound, heartbreaking pity. Every time I forgot where I placed my glasses, I saw the exhaustion in her eyes deepen. She was a brilliant ER nurse, trained to save lives, but she was entirely blind to the parasite draining her own. I needed to perform an intervention, and in medicine, you don't perform triage in the middle of a chaotic street. You need a sterile, controlled environment. The opportunity arrived on a rainy Thursday night. Julian was attending a networking gala downtown for his real estate firm, meaning he wouldn't be home until past midnight. My granddaughter Nia was fast asleep in her room. Chloe was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a lukewarm cup of chamomile tea, her dark scrubs wrinkled from a grueling 12-hour shift. I walked into the kitchen. I didn't shuffle. I didn't hunch my shoulders. I stood at my full height, my spine as straight as a steel rod, and locked the kitchen door. "Mama?" Chloe asked, blinking through her exhaustion. "Why did you lock the door? Are you confused again? Julian isn't home yet." "I know exactly where Julian is, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping the fragile, wavering timbre I had adopted for weeks. It was sharp, clear, and rang with the unquestionable authority of a director of nursing. "And my mind is as sharp as a scalpel. Put the tea down. We need to talk." Chloe froze. The mug hovered halfway to her lips. She stared at me, her medical training suddenly kicking in as she processed the instantaneous change in my posture, my tone, and my eyes. I walked over to the island and dropped a thick manila envelope onto the granite counter. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. I pulled out the photocopies Desmond and I had compiled. I laid them out in a neat, clinical row under the harsh overhead pendant lights. "Read them," I commanded. Chloe hesitantly reached for the first page. It was the psychiatric evaluation signed by Dr. Valerie Sterling. Her eyes scanned the medical jargon, tracking the fabricated symptoms of early-onset Alzheimer's. Her brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Mama, what is this? I've never heard of a Dr. Sterling. When were you evaluated?" "I wasn't," I replied coldly. "Look at the next page." She picked up the medical power of attorney. I watched her eyes land on the primary agent's name, Julian Hayes. But it was the next document, the leveraged buyout prospectus for Whispering Pines, and the quitclaim deed to my house, that made the blood completely drain from her face. "He's buying a nursing home," she whispered, her voice trembling as the pieces snapped together. "He's using the house for collateral, but he can't do that. The bank needs your signature. You'd have to be legally incapacitated." "Read the admission form, Chloe," I said softly. She turned to the final page. Patient name, Eleanor Vance. Facility, Whispering Pines Assisted Living. The paper slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor. Chloe clapped a hand over her mouth, a choked gasp escaping her lips. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a terror I hadn't seen since she was a little girl waking up from a nightmare. "He's going to lock you away," she sobbed, stepping back as if the counter itself were on fire. "He's going to take the house and lock you in a ward." "Yes," I said. "But he needed a federal foundation to make it look legal. He needed a signature." Chloe looked down at the forged signature on the power of attorney. Suddenly her knees buckled. She gripped the edge of the granite counter, her knuckles turning white, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. "Mama," she choked out, tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "Mama, the signature on the secondary witness line, the one validating your cognitive decline before the notary." I looked at her, my heart twisting. I already knew. "I signed it," Chloe confessed, her voice shattering into 1,000 pieces. She slid down the cabinets, collapsing onto the kitchen floor. "I signed it, Mama. I didn't know. Oh God, I didn't know." I knelt beside her on the cold hardwood floor. "He told me you were getting dangerous," Chloe wept, burying her face in her hands. "He said you left the stove on while Naya was in the room. He said you wandered out into the street at night. I was working so many shifts I wasn't here to see it, and he was so convincing. He said we needed the paperwork just in case of an emergency to protect you, to make sure you got the best care if the Alzheimer's got worse. He used my guilt against me, Mama. He made me think I was saving your life." Gaslighting. It is the most insidious form of domestic abuse. It doesn't leave bruises on the skin. It leaves fractures in the mind, making the victim doubt their own reality until they are entirely dependent on the predator. Julian had weaponized my daughter's love for me to secure his own theft. Chloe suddenly scrambled to her feet, her grief rapidly mutating into a frantic, chaotic panic. "I'm calling the police," she hyperventilated, lunging for her phone on the counter. "I'm calling them right now. I'm taking Nia and we are leaving. I'll testify against him. I'll tear him apart." I stood up and grabbed her wrist. My grip was like a vice. "Stop," I ordered. "Let me go, Mama. He's a monster." "I said stop," I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip. "Crying and panicking will not stop the bleeding, Chloe. Look at me." She froze, her chest heaving, her eyes wild and terrified. "If you call the police right now, what do you think happens?" I asked, keeping my voice low, intense, and absolutely steady. "Julian is a wealthy, white-collar broker with a fake medical file and a legally notarized document that has your signature on it. He will tell the cops you are a hysterical, overworked nurse who is helping her delusional mother resist medical care. You are an accessory to federal fraud on paper, Chloe. If he goes down tonight, he drags you into the cell with him. You lose your nursing license. And worse, you lose custody of Nia." The mention of her daughter's name acted like a defibrillator. Chloe gasped, the chaotic panic draining away, leaving behind a cold, stark terror. "We do not act out of fear," I told her, releasing her wrist and placing my hands firmly on her shoulders. "We are nurses. What do we do when a patient is hemorrhaging?" Chloe swallowed hard, her training fighting through the tears. We apply pressure. We stabilize." "Exactly," I said, wiping a tear from her cheek with my thumb. "We stabilize. Julian doesn't know that I know. He doesn't know that my lawyer has already secretly blocked the deed transfer. He thinks he is winning. And to put him in a federal prison where he belongs, without taking you down with him, we have to let him keep thinking he's winning. I need a spy on the inside, Chloe. I need you." Chloe looked at the documents on the counter, then back at me. The exhausted, manipulated woman who had walked into the kitchen was gone. In her place was a mother who had just realized a predator was sleeping in the room next to her daughter. She stood up straight, wiping her face with the back of her hand, her jaw set. "Tell me the treatment plan, Mama," Chloe whispered. The alliance was formed. The tumor had been identified. It was time to start cutting. For a trauma nurse, there is nothing quite as terrifying as treating a patient you love. The emotional detachment you rely on to keep your hands steady threatens to evaporate. For the next week, Chloe had to treat the man who was actively trying to destroy her mother as if he were simply a difficult patient. She had to go back to sharing a bed with a predator, maintaining her exhausted, compliant facade while waiting for the perfect moment to slip the needle in. Julian was arrogant, but he wasn't careless. He rarely let his encrypted work laptop out of his sight. But a man who thinks he has already won the war tends to get sloppy with his daily patrols. The opportunity arrived on a Tuesday morning. Julian had a breakfast meeting with a commercial lender, likely trying to hustle a bridge loan for his failing Whispering Pines acquisition. He was running late. I was sitting at the kitchen table, dutifully playing the declining mother, staring blankly at a bowl of oatmeal. Chloe was at the sink, washing coffee mugs. Julian hurried into the kitchen, his tie draped over his shoulder, a smear of shaving cream still on his jaw. He tossed his leather briefcase onto the island and turned his back to grab a travel mug from the cabinet. In his rush, he hadn't zipped the briefcase. His laptop sat right at the top, glowing in sleep mode. Chloe didn't hesitate. Her ER instincts took over. While Julian was cursing under his breath about the missing lid to his travel mug, Chloe seamlessly slipped her hand into his briefcase, popped a small, high-capacity USB flash drive into the side port of his laptop, and initiated an automated background cloning script she had bought online the night before. It was a race against a ticking clock. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Julian slammed a cabinet door shut. "I swear, Eleanor, you must be moving the lids," Julian muttered, finally finding one and snapping it onto his mug. He turned around. Chloe was perfectly positioned, leaning casually against the counter, blocking his view of the briefcase. "You're going to be late, Julian," she said, her voice a flawless mask of mild, wifely concern. "Don't take it out on Mama." Julian sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know, it's just stress, babe. This new deal it's taking everything out of me." He leaned in and kissed her cheek. "I'm doing this for us, for our future." He reached around her, grabbed the handles of his briefcase, and hoisted it off the counter. The laptop slid slightly, but the USB drive was hidden by the leather flap. He zipped it shut in one fluid motion, walked out the door, and the heavy thud of his car door echoed a moment later. Chloe waited until his car pulled out of the driveway. Then she reached into her scrub pocket, her hand trembling violently as the adrenaline finally crashed through her system. She pulled out the tiny silver USB drive. The cloning script had finished with 3 seconds to spare. "Vital signs are stable," I murmured, watching her from the table. "Bring the drive to my office." We locked the door to my home office, drew the blinds, and plugged the drive into my secure air-gapped computer. What we found on Julian's hard drive wasn't just a financial ledger. It was a digital autopsy of his marriage. We bypassed the encrypted firm folders and went straight for his personal cloud backups and email archives. It took us less than an hour to piece together the entire, sickening pathology of his plan. There were dozens of emails between Julian and the mysterious Dr. Valerie Sterling, but they weren't strictly professional. I clicked on an email thread dated 2 months prior. The subject line read, "The Elmwood Problem. Valerie," Julian had written. "The appraisal on the house came back higher than expected. It's enough to cover the remaining $800,000 for the Whispering Pines buyout and leave us plenty of runway. The old bat is starting to ask questions about her mail, though. We need to accelerate the timeline. Have the psych evaluation finalized by Friday. Once she's in the facility, her daughter will be too overwhelmed with work and the kid to look into the LLC structure." Valerie's reply was waiting just below it. "The paperwork is done, Julian. Make sure Chloe signs the witness line on the POA so she's legally tethered to the diagnosis. If she tries to fight it later, we remind her she's an accessory. I can't wait until this is over. Costa Rica is calling our names, baby." I stopped scrolling. The silence in the office was deafening. I slowly turned my head to look at my daughter. Chloe was staring at the screen, her dark eyes wide and unblinking. The glow of the monitor cast harsh, unforgiving shadows across her face. Julian wasn't just stealing my house to fund a business. He and Valerie Sterling were partners in every sense of the word. They were going to use my money to buy the nursing home, lock me inside it, use Chloe as a legal shield, and then abandon her and Nia entirely. "Costa Rica," Chloe whispered, the words scraping against her throat. "He told me he was looking at family vacation packages for next summer. For Nia's birthday." A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time there was no panic. There was no chaotic hyperventilation. The sorrow had instantly flash-frozen into absolute pure rage. In nursing, there is a moment when a patient's pain stops being a symptom and becomes a weapon. Chloe had just weaponized her grief. "He called you an old bat," Chloe said, her voice dropping an octave, sounding more like me than she ever had in her life. She reached across the desk and took the mouse from my hand. "Let's see what else this bastard is hiding." For the next 3 hours, we dug through the rot. We found the offshore accounts Valerie had set up. We found the communications with the shady notary who had stamped my forged signature. We gathered enough digital evidence to not just sink Julian's career, but to bury him under the federal penitentiary. But I didn't just want him arrested. Arrests can be messy. High-priced lawyers can drag things out, claiming the hard drive was obtained illegally, claiming the emails were out of context. I didn't want a long, drawn-out trial that would drain my daughter's spirit. I wanted Julian to hang himself in a public square, with the federal authorities watching him tie the knot. I picked up my prepaid phone and dialed Desmond. "We have the pathology report," I told him when he answered. "Dr. Valerie Sterling is his mistress. They are planning to flee the country after the Whispering Pines deal closes, and I am committed. We have the emails." "Send them to my secure server," Desmond said, his tone instantly shifting from a lawyer to a prosecutor. "This changes everything, Eleanor. With proof of flight risk and wire fraud across international lines, the FBI will absolutely fast-track an indictment. But we still need the smoking gun. We need him to attempt the final execution of the fraud on paper, in person, so there is zero deniability." "I know," I said, looking at a framed photograph on my desk of Chloe and Nia. "Julian is short $800,000 for his buyout. He thinks he's getting it from my house. But what if he suddenly found out I was sitting on a much larger, completely liquid asset? Something he could steal without having to wait for a real estate closing?" Desmond paused. "A bait file. You want to dangle a phantom account in front of him." "Not a phantom," I corrected smoothly. "A real account. When my late husband passed, his life insurance payout and my hospital pension were rolled into a private high-yield retirement trust. It's currently sitting at $1.5 million. Julian doesn't know about it because it's managed by an out-of-state boutique firm. I want to move that money into a local account, and I want Julian to find the paperwork." "Eleanor, that is extremely dangerous," Desmond warned. "If he gets access to those routing numbers with his forged power of attorney—" "He won't get access," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "Because you are going to coordinate with the FBI to establish the receiving account as a federal sting trust. The moment Julian tries to use his forged medical documents to sign for that $1.5 million, he won't be stealing from me. He will be attempting to defraud the federal government directly." A low, appreciative chuckle came over the line. "You always were the most terrifying woman in the hospital, Eleanor. I'll make the calls. Get the bait ready." I hung up the phone and looked at Chloe. She was no longer crying. She was sitting up straight, her eyes locked on the monitor, memorizing the face of the man she was about to destroy. "What's the next step, Mama?" she asked. "We print a very official-looking bank statement," I replied, "and we leave it somewhere a rat can't help but look. There is a psychological vulnerability in every greedy man, the belief that he is always one lucky break away from a masterpiece. Julian thought his masterpiece was stealing my house. He had no idea his ambition was entirely too small. To catch a rat, you don't just leave a crumb of cheese on the floor. You build a palace of cheese right above the spring-loaded trap and let his own gluttony do the heavy lifting." The bait arrived on a Thursday via certified mail. Desmond had pulled every string he had with his federal contacts. The heavy, cream-colored envelope bore the embossed logo of a legitimate high-end boutique wealth management firm out of New York. Inside was a meticulously drafted quarterly statement for an irrevocable retirement trust. The balance printed at the bottom of the page in bold black ink was unmistakable: $1,542,000. It was entirely liquid. And, according to the carefully forged fine print Desmond and the FBI had engineered, it was fully accessible to anyone holding a validated medical power of attorney. I didn't hide the statement. When you want someone to find something, you have to make them believe they discovered it through their own cleverness. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen island with a stack of mundane junk mail, utility bills, and the cream-colored envelope. I opened it, leaving the pages slightly askew. When I heard the familiar rumble of Julian's car pulling into the driveway, I stood up, knocked over my half-empty teacup, and left the papers scattered across the granite. I retreated to the living room, sitting in my armchair by the window, wrapping a knitted shawl around my shoulders. I stared blankly out at the rain, adopting the hollow, vacant posture of a woman whose mind was slowly drifting out to sea. Julian walked through the front door, shaking the rain from his expensive umbrella. "Eleanor?" he called out, his voice carrying that familiar patronizing edge. "Why is there spilled tea all over the kitchen counter?" Chloe is going to have a fit when she gets home from her shift. I didn't answer. I just kept staring out the window, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. I heard his heavy footsteps stride into the kitchen. I heard the rustle of paper towels as he wiped up the tea. And then I heard the sound I was waiting for. The sharp, abrupt silence that follows a massive shock. The rustling stopped. I could practically hear his heart rate spike from the other room. Julian was a real estate broker. He knew how to read a financial statement. He was looking at a piece of paper that solved every single one of his problems. Whispering Pines only required $800,000. This account held nearly double that. It was cash. It was liquid. And if his fake Alzheimer's diagnosis held up, he wouldn't even have to wait for a messy real estate closing to get his hands on it. A minute later, Julian walked into the living room. He was holding the cream-colored statement. His hands were actually trembling. He tried to compose his face into a mask of gentle concern, but the feral, hungry gleam in his eyes was impossible to hide. "Eleanor," he said, his voice artificially soft as he knelt beside my armchair. "Mama E, what is this?" I slowly turned my head to look at him, blinking as if trying to clear a thick fog from my brain. I let my jaw go slack. What is what, Julian?" I whispered, my voice frail and wandering. "This letter," he pressed, holding the statement up. He was practically vibrating with adrenaline. "It's from a wealth management firm in New York. It says you have a trust account, a very large trust account. Have you been hiding this from Chloe and me?" I furrowed my brow, acting deeply confused and slightly distressed. I reached out with a trembling hand to touch the paper, then pulled it back. I don't know," I stammered, letting a tear pool in the corner of my eye. "My husband, Henry set something up before he passed. For the hospital pension. But I can't remember the passwords, Julian. The man on the phone last week. He said they needed my signature to move it to a local bank, but I got so confused by the paperwork. I just left it on the counter. Did I spill my tea? I'm so sorry, Julian." Hook, line, and sinker. Julian's face softened into a smile so purely evil it belonged in a horror film. He saw a vulnerable, broken woman who had just handed him a winning lottery ticket because she didn't know how to cash it. "Oh, Mama E," Julian cooed, reaching out to pat my knee. "Don't you worry about a thing. You shouldn't be stressing your mind with complex financial transfers. That's why I'm here. That's why Chloe and I are looking out for you." He folded the statement meticulously and slipped it into the inside breast pocket of his suit jacket, right next to his heart. "I'm going to take this," he said smoothly. "I'll handle the wealth management firm for you. I'll make sure the money is safe and secure. You just rest here by the window." "You'll take care of it?" I asked, looking up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "Because I just can't seem to hold on to my thoughts lately. It scares me, Julian." "I know it does," he whispered, standing up and adjusting his tie, his posture suddenly radiating the arrogant confidence of a man who had just conquered the world. "But the scary part is almost over. I promise you, Eleanor. In just a few days, you're going to be in a place where you never have to worry about anything ever again." He meant Whispering Pines. He meant the locked ward. He turned and walked briskly out of the living room, pulling his phone from his pocket. He didn't even wait until he was out the front door to dial. I heard him whisper urgently into the receiver as he stepped onto the porch. "Valerie, cancel the bridge loan application for the facility. We don't need the house anymore. I just found the mother lode." The front door clicked shut. I sat in the armchair for another 30 seconds, ensuring his car had pulled away from the curb. Once the house was dead silent, the frail, trembling old woman vanished. I sat up straight, wiped the single manufactured tear from my cheek, and picked up my prepaid phone. I dialed Desmond's direct line. "The parasite took the bait," I said, my voice returning to its normal, administrative calm. "He has the routing numbers for the federal sting account." "Excellent," Desmond replied, the satisfaction evident in his gravelly voice. "The FBI task force is on standby, but he can't execute a wire transfer of that magnitude over the phone or online with a power of attorney. The banking regulations require him to present the original notarized POA and his identification in person at a physical branch." "He knows that," I said, looking at the spot on the kitchen counter where the fake statement had been. "He's greedy, but he isn't stupid. He'll try to execute the transfer at his primary bank downtown. When do we close the net?" "We don't," Desmond said. "We let him walk into the bank. The moment he slides that forged medical document across the teller's counter to access a federally protected trust, the trap snaps shut. We just have to make sure he brings the forged paperwork to the finish line. He will, I promised. He's already counting the money. In the emergency room, there is a concept known as the golden hour. It is the critical window of time immediately following a traumatic injury during which prompt medical treatment offers the highest chance of survival. But if you want to force a man into making a fatal mistake, you don't give him an hour. You give him an adrenaline spike. You compress his timeline until his logic shuts down and his greed takes the wheel. Julian had the fake trust statement and the forged power of attorney. But a man like him, a commercial real estate broker, was naturally cautious. Left to his own devices, he might spend a week verifying the routing numbers or quietly consulting a shady tax lawyer to ensure the $1.5 million transfer wouldn't raise any IRS red flags. We couldn't give him a week. Desmond's federal sting account was primed and waiting, but if Julian looked too closely at the fine print before walking into the bank, he might sense the trap. We needed him to run blindly into the vault. We needed him to panic. It was Wednesday evening, less than 6 hours after Julian had pocketed the bait. The rain was still beating against the living room windows. I was sitting on the sofa, playing the docile, declining mother, mindlessly folding the same laundry towel over and over. Julian was pacing the kitchen, tapping away on his phone, likely running the numbers for his imminent flight to Costa Rica with Dr. Valerie Sterling. Then the front door flew open. Chloe burst into the house. She didn't bother taking off her wet raincoat. She slammed the heavy oak door shut behind her, the sound reverberating through the entire house. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She had spent the last hour sitting in her car in the driveway, deliberately hyperventilating to bring a flush to her skin and tears to her eyes. She looked absolutely, genuinely terrified. "Chloe?" Julian asked, pocketing his phone and stepping out of the kitchen. "Babe, what's wrong? You're home early." Chloe dropped her heavy nursing bag onto the hardwood floor. It hit with a loud, chaotic thud. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and let out a raw, broken sob. "It's over, Julian," she cried, her voice cracking perfectly. "Everything is falling apart. They're coming to take her." Julian's face went rigid. He shot a quick, paranoid glance in my direction. I kept my head down, folding my towel, acting entirely oblivious to the commotion, but my ears were dialed in to every single syllable. "Who is coming, Chloe?" Julian asked, his voice dropping into a low, urgent hiss. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his fingers digging into her raincoat. "Keep your voice down. Tell me exactly what happened." Chloe looked up at him, her face a mask of exhausted despair. "Dr. Eris called me," she stammered, naming my actual retired primary care physician, a man Julian knew I had trusted for decades. The pharmacy flagged Mama's Medicare denial and sent a report to his office. "Julian, they saw the address change. They saw the suspended coverage. Dr. Eris said it looked like financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." Julian's jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. The color began to drain from his face. "He doesn't know what he's talking about. We have the legal paperwork. I have the power of attorney." "It doesn't matter," Chloe sobbed, burying her face against his chest, playing the desperate, overwhelmed wife to perfection. "Dr. Eris is a mandated reporter, Julian. He legally had to file a complaint with the state. He told me that Adult Protective Services is sending an investigator to the house on Friday morning. They're going to interview Mama. They're going to audit her accounts. Julian, if they think she's being neglected or exploited, the state can petition a judge to appoint a public guardian. They will freeze every single asset she has. They'll freeze the house. They'll lock us out entirely." I watched Julian's reflection in the dark glass of the living room window. The absolute, unadulterated terror in his eyes was a beautiful thing to witness. A state-appointed guardian. It was the ultimate nightmare for a con artist. If Adult Protective Services got involved, his forged psychiatric evaluation signed by his mistress wouldn't hold up to an independent state medical review. His forged power of attorney would be shredded, and the $1.5 million sitting in the New York trust account would be locked in a federal probate freeze for years, completely out of his reach. He was out of time. "Friday," Julian repeated, his breath shallow. "They're coming on Friday?" "Yes," Chloe wept, clutching his lapels. "Julian, what do we do? If they take over her care, how are we going to afford the mortgage? How are we going to protect her money? Julian stared over her shoulder, his mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I could see the greed and the panic colliding in his brain. The careful, calculating broker was gone. He was now a desperate thief staring at a ticking clock. He had 36 hours before the state theoretically knocked on the door. He had to drain my assets immediately. "Listen to me, Chloe," Julian said, his voice hard, authoritative, and entirely ruthless. He gripped her face in his hands. "You are going to call in sick to the hospital tomorrow. You stay here with Eleanor. Do not let her leave the house. Do not answer the door for anyone." "What are you going to do?" Chloe asked, her eyes wide with manufactured trust. "I'm going to secure your mother's future," Julian lied without a single ounce of hesitation. "I'm going to the bank first thing tomorrow morning. I am going to consolidate all of her accounts, including a hidden retirement fund I found out about today. I'm moving it all into an untraceable offshore LLC before the state can freeze it. By the time Adult Protective Services shows up on Friday, there won't be a single dime left for them to touch. We will have total control." "Can you do that?" Chloe whispered, acting awestruck by his taking charge. "Is it legal?" "I have the power of attorney," Julian stated, patting his breast pocket where the forged documents and the bait statement rested. "It's completely legal until a judge says otherwise. I just have to beat them to the punch. I'll execute the wire transfer tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp." He kissed her forehead, entirely oblivious to the fact that she was mentally charting his time of death. "Go wash your face," Julian ordered gently. "I need to make a phone call." Chloe nodded meekly and walked down the hallway toward their bedroom. Julian stepped out onto the back patio, pulling his phone out again. I didn't need to hear the conversation to know he was calling Valerie Sterling to pack her bags for Costa Rica. The house fell silent, save for the rain. I stopped folding the towel. I looked down the dark hallway. Chloe was standing in the shadows just outside her bedroom door. She caught my eye. She didn't smile. I didn't nod. We simply exchanged the cold, silent look of two surgical nurses watching a patient willingly strap himself to the operating table. The adrenaline push had worked flawlessly. Julian was no longer walking toward the trap. He was sprinting. And tomorrow morning, at 9 a.m., the federal government would be waiting to catch him. In hospital administration, there is a very specific protocol for recording a time of death. You do not log the moment the patient closes their eyes, or the moment the family starts to cry. You log the exact second the attending physician looks at the flatline on the monitor and officially declares that the heart has stopped. Thursday morning at 9 o'clock was the moment Julian Hayes scheduled his own termination. He woke up early, moving through the house with the frantic, restless energy of a predator who had smelled blood. He showered, shaved, and dressed in his most expensive charcoal gray suit. It was the armor of a white-collar thief, designed to project absolute authority and unquestionable success. He packed his leather briefcase, double-checking the breast pocket of his jacket where the forged medical power of attorney and the bait statement rested against his chest. Chloe and I played our parts perfectly one last time. I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall, while Chloe poured him a cup of coffee with trembling hands. "I'll be back by noon," Julian told her, kissing her on the cheek. He didn't even look at me. In his mind, I was already a ghost haunting a locked ward at Whispering Pines. "Everything is going to be fine, Chloe. I'm securing our future." The moment his car pulled out of the driveway and turned the corner, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere in the house vanished. Chloe let out a long, shuddering exhale, dropping the terrified wife persona like a heavy winter coat. She turned to me, her dark eyes sharp and clear. "Vital signs are dropping, Mama," she said, her voice steady. "Then let's go call it," I replied, standing up straight and reaching for my actual coat. I didn't need the knitted shawl or the hunched posture anymore. I dressed in a tailored navy blazer, slacks, and my most comfortable nursing shoes. Today was not a day for frailty. It was a day for surgery. Desmond was already waiting for us in the lobby of the downtown First National Bank. It was an imposing building of marble and glass, a cathedral of finance where men like Julian came to worship. Desmond was standing near the grand entrance, speaking quietly with two men in unassuming dark suits. As Chloe and I approached, Desmond gave a curt nod. "Eleanor, Chloe," Desmond said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Allow me to introduce Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Vance from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. We have a secure viewing room set up adjacent to the branch manager's office." "Is he inside?" I asked, my eyes scanning the bustling bank floor. He walked in 10 minutes ago, Agent Miller replied, adjusting his cuffs. He's currently sitting with Mr. Harrison, the branch manager. The manager has been fully briefed. The Bait account is a federally monitored sting trust. All we need is for Mr. Hayes to present the fraudulent documents and sign the authorization for the wire transfer. The moment his pen leaves the paper, the federal crime is complete. We were escorted down a quiet, carpeted hallway to a small conference room. One entire wall was made of one-way glass, looking directly into the branch manager's office. There he was, Julian Hayes. He was sitting in a plush leather chair across from Mr. Harrison, projecting an aura of composed, tragic burden. He had laid out the thick blue folder on the desk. Even through the soundproof glass, I could read his body language perfectly. He was leaning forward, undoubtedly spinning a heartbreaking tale about his poor, declining mother-in-law, explaining how he needed to immediately consolidate her retirement trust to protect her from state interference and fund her long-term care. Mr. Harrison, playing his part brilliantly, nodded with solemn sympathy. He picked up the forged medical power of attorney, examining the notary stamp. He looked at the fake psychiatric evaluation signed by Dr. Valerie Sterling. Then he looked at the cream-colored statement from the New York wealth management firm. A transfer of $1.5 million is highly irregular to execute so quickly, Mr. Hayes. Mr. Harrison's voice crackled through the small audio monitor on our side of the glass. Especially routing it directly to an offshore LLC. Are you certain this is in Mrs. Vance's best interest? It breaks my heart, Mr. Harrison. Julian lied, his voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. But my mother-in-law's cognitive decline has been rapid and severe. She is no longer capable of managing her own affairs, and there are external family complications. I have to secure this capital immediately to ensure she gets the specialized round-the-clock care she requires. As her legally appointed agent, I am authorizing the full transfer. I felt Chloe's hand grip my arm, her nails dug into my blazer, her whole body tense with a mixture of rage and anticipation. Mr. Harrison sighed softly and typed something into his computer. The printer on his desk whirred to life, sliding out a single sheet of paper, the wire transfer authorization form. Very well, Mr. Hayes, the manager said, pushing the paper across the polished wood, along with a heavy silver pen. I just need your signature right there on the bottom line, authorizing the movement of federal trust funds under the power of attorney. Julian didn't hesitate. He didn't read the fine print. His greed had completely blinded his logic, just as the adrenaline push had intended. He picked up the pen. I watched the silver barrel catch the fluorescent light as he pressed the tip to the paper. He signed his name with a violent, triumphant flourish. Done, Julian said, pushing the paper back. He leaned back in his chair, unbuttoning his suit jacket, letting out a breath he had probably been holding since he woke up. He thought he had won. He thought he was a millionaire. He thought he was untouchable. Time of death, I whispered in the dark viewing room. Agent Miller nodded to his partner. Move in. I didn't stay behind the glass. I opened the side door of the viewing room and stepped out into the hallway, Chloe right beside me. The two federal agents flanked us, but they let me take the lead. I walked up to the heavy glass door of the manager's office and pushed it open. Julian was mid-laugh, thanking Mr. Harrison for his swift assistance, when the sound of the door swinging open interrupted him. He turned his head, a polite, dismissive smile already forming on his lips. The smile died the instant he saw me. I didn't look frail. I wasn't hunched over. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, my eyes burning with a cold administrative fury that pinned him to his chair. Chloe stood beside me, not as a weeping, terrified wife, but as a woman who had finally woken up from a very long, very dark nightmare. Eleanor? Julian stammered, the color draining from his face so fast he looked like a cadaver. He scrambled to stand up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Chloe? What are you doing here? You're supposed to be at home. I told you, Julian, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet office, smooth and razor sharp. My memory is perfectly fine, but it seems you forgot who you were dealing with. Julian's eyes darted frantically between me, Chloe, and the two men in dark suits stepping into the room behind us. His chest began to heave. The realization of what was happening crashed into him like a derailed train. He looked down at the wire transfer document he had just signed, then back up at the federal agents. Julian Hayes, Agent Miller said, his voice devoid of any emotion, stepping forward and flashing his gold badge. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and the attempted embezzlement of federally protected trust funds." "No!" Julian gasped, stumbling backward until his back hit the glass wall. "No, this is a mistake. I have the power of attorney. She's sick. She doesn't know what she's doing." "The only sick person in this room is you, Julian," Chloe said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a deep, resonant power. "And Dr. Valerie Sterling. Oh, don't look so surprised. The FBI is picking her up at her clinic right now. Costa Rica is going to have to wait." Julian's knees practically buckled at the mention of Valerie's name and their escape plan. The arrogant, untouchable broker dissolved in less than 10 seconds. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic pleading. "Mama E, Eleanor, please," he begged, raising his hands. "We can fix this. I was just trying to help the family. I was just—" "Save your breath, Mr. Hayes," Desmond said, stepping into the doorway, holding up a sleek black folder. "Your fraudulent POA was legally revoked by my office weeks ago. That account you just tried to drain is a federal sting trust. You didn't just try to rob your mother-in-law. You just committed a felony against the United States government." Agent Miller grabbed Julian's arm, twisting it expertly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the bank office was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 35 years. It was the sound of a tumor being successfully excised. As the agents marched Julian out of the office, his head bowed, his $1,000 suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume, I looked at the forged documents scattered on the manager's desk. The quarantine was over. The patient was going to survive. In a hospital, the surgery might be the main event, but the recovery room is where you find out if the patient is actually going to live. You check the vitals. You look for signs of infection. You make absolutely sure you got clean margins around the tumor before you stitch the wound closed. Watching the FBI lead Julian Hayes out of the bank in handcuffs was deeply satisfying, but my family's recovery was just beginning. Desmond, Chloe, and I stood in the quiet aftermath of the branch manager's office. Mr. Harrison, the manager who had played his part so perfectly, offered us a tray of bottled water. I took one, my hands entirely steady. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, but also a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Desmond's phone buzzed in his suit pocket. He pulled it out, read the encrypted text message, and a grim smile spread across his face. "Clean margins, Eleanor," Desmond announced, looking up at us. "Agent Miller just confirmed the simultaneous raid. A federal task force walked into Dr. Valerie Sterling's private psychiatric clinic 20 minutes ago. They caught her sitting at her desk, reviewing the final closing documents for the Whispering Pines Assisted Living Facility. They also found 2 first-class one-way tickets to San Jose, Costa Rica in her purse." Chloe let out a breath that sounded half like a laugh and half like a sob. She was really going to do it. She was going to sign my mother's life away and get on a plane. "She isn't getting on a plane anytime soon, Chloe," I said, placing a firm, reassuring hand on my daughter's shoulder. "Dr. Sterling is facing the exact same federal conspiracy and healthcare fraud charges as your husband. She falsified a medical diagnosis to facilitate the theft of a federally protected asset. She will lose her medical license, her clinic, and her freedom. The infection is completely cleared." We left the bank and drove back to Elmwood Drive. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the Chicago streets slick and shining under breaking clouds. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it had when we left that morning, but it felt entirely different. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had hung in the air for weeks was gone. The parasite had been evicted, but there was still cleaning up to do. Chloe didn't sit down on the couch to cry. She didn't ask for a cup of tea. She walked straight past the kitchen, marched down the hallway, and opened the door to the master bedroom she had shared with Julian. I followed her, standing quietly in the doorway. She pulled 3 heavy-duty black trash bags from the hall closet. She didn't use his expensive leather luggage. She walked over to his immaculate closet, grabbed a handful of his $1,000 tailored suits, the suits he had worn while gaslighting her and planning to lock me in a ward, and shoved them unceremoniously into the garbage bag. "Do you want me to call a moving company, Chloe?" I asked gently. "We can have his things put in a storage unit." "No," Chloe said, her voice hard and resolute as she stripped his silk ties from the rack. "His lawyer can send someone to pick these bags off the front porch. I am not spending another dime or another second of my life managing Julian's comfort. He used my guilt to blind me, Mama. He used my exhaustion against me. I let a monster sleep in the room next to my daughter. She stopped, her hands gripping the plastic rim of the trash bag, her shoulders shaking slightly. The reality of her narrow escape was crashing down on her. "You didn't let him in, Chloe," I reminded her, stepping into the room and putting my arms around her. He lied his way in. Predators don't wear signs around their necks. They wear tailored suits, and they tell you exactly what you want to hear. He manipulated your love and your dedication as a nurse. That is his sin, not yours. Chloe leaned into me, burying her face in my shoulder just like she did when she was a little girl. But she wasn't a little girl anymore. She was a survivor. "I'm filing for full custody of Nia tomorrow," Chloe whispered fiercely into my shoulder. "And a restraining order. He will never ever be alone with her again." "Desmond already has the paperwork drafted," I told her, smoothing her hair. "Julian's federal indictment for fraud is more than enough for a family court judge to grant an emergency protective order and grant you sole custody. He has no money to fight us, Chloe. His assets are frozen, his offshore accounts have been seized by the FBI, and his career is permanently destroyed. He is nothing but a ghost now." Over the next few days, the house transformed into a fortress of healing. I called a locksmith and had every single deadbolt and window latch replaced. I threw away the ceramic jar where the spare keys used to be kept. We scrubbed Julian's home office from top to bottom, turning the sterile, secretive space into a bright, colorful playroom for Nia. I didn't have to hunch my shoulders anymore. I didn't have to pretend to forget where I put my coffee cup. I walked through my home with the upright posture of a woman who had faced down a hostile takeover and won. The state investigators from Adult Protective Services never showed up on Friday. The call Julian was so terrified of had been a complete fabrication, an injection of pure adrenaline orchestrated by a brilliant ER nurse to force his hand. But a week later, we did get a different kind of phone call. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, helping Nia with her second-grade math homework, the afternoon sun streaming warmly through the windows. Chloe was sitting at the island, reviewing a fresh stack of legal documents Desmond had sent over. Her phone rang. The caller ID displayed a federal correctional facility in the South Loop. It was Julian. He was allowed his one monitored phone call from federal holding before his arraignment. Chloe looked at the ringing phone. A month ago, she would have answered it in a heartbeat, terrified of his anger, desperate for his approval. Now she just stared at the screen, her face an unreadable mask of absolute calm. She picked up the phone. She didn't say hello. She just pressed the green button and put it on speaker so I could hear. "Chloe?" Julian's voice crackled through the tiny speaker. The smooth, arrogant timbre was completely gone. He sounded small, ragged, and terrified. "Chloe, please, you have to talk to me. You have to tell your mother to drop the charges. They're talking about 10 years, Chloe. 10 years in federal lockup. My public defender says the evidence is airtight. You have to help me. I'm your husband." Chloe looked at me across the kitchen island. I gave her a single, slow nod. "You aren't my husband, Julian," Chloe said, her voice as cold and clear as winter ice. "You're a symptom, and we already cut you out." She didn't wait for him to respond. She didn't listen to his pleading or his excuses. She simply reached out with one steady finger and pressed the red button, ending the call and blocking the number forever. In healthcare, the final step of any successful procedure isn't the surgery itself. It's the discharge. It is the moment you hand the patient their chart, give them their aftercare instructions, and watch them walk out the double doors, finally free to live their life again without the monitor wires holding them back. 6 months after the federal raid at the bank, I sat in the front row of a polished mahogany courtroom in downtown Chicago. I wore my best navy suit. Chloe sat beside me, holding my hand, her posture perfectly straight. Julian Hayes stood before the federal judge, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that didn't fit quite right. He looked older, smaller, and entirely stripped of the arrogant armor he used to wear. His defense attorney had tried to argue for leniency, claiming Julian was simply an overwhelmed family man who made a desperate financial mistake under the pressure of the real estate market. But Desmond and the federal prosecutors had buried that lie under a mountain of digital evidence, offshore routing numbers, and the undeniable audio proof that he had weaponized my daughter's love against her. The judge didn't buy the act. Julian was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary, with no possibility of early parole, followed by 5 years of supervised release. He was also ordered to pay massive restitution, though his accounts had already been drained to cover his mounting legal fees. Dr. Valerie Sterling didn't fare much better. She lost her medical license permanently, her clinic was seized by the state, and she was sentenced to 7 years for her role in the conspiracy. The Costa Rican son would have to wait a very, very long time. When the gavel fell, the sharp wooden crack echoed through the courtroom. It was the sound of a door locking forever. Julian turned to look at us one last time as the bailiff led him away. Chloe didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She just stared right through him, a survivor watching the disease finally being rolled out of the room. Today, my house on Elmwood Drive is full of light again. We tore down the heavy deadbolt on the guest room door. That room now belongs entirely to my granddaughter, Nia. It's painted a bright, cheerful yellow, filled with books and art supplies. Chloe finished her advanced certifications and was recently promoted to charge nurse in the ER. She commands her floor with the same fierce, unyielding grace that she used to reclaim her life. We sit on the back porch in the evenings, drinking tea and watching Nia play in the yard. We don't talk about Julian anymore. He isn't a ghost haunting our halls. He is just a mistake we survived. I am 63 years old. Society often tells women my age that we are supposed to quietly fade into the background. They tell us that our sharpest days are behind us, that we should hand over the reins and just be grateful for the help. But wisdom isn't frailty, and age is not an invitation for exploitation. I spent 35 years learning how to read the symptoms of a failing body. But the most important lesson I learned in retirement is that you must also vigilantly monitor the symptoms of a failing character. Predators don't always pick locks to get into your home. Sometimes they marry into your family. They sit at your dinner table. They smile. They call you mama. And they use your own love as a blindfold. If you take anything away from my story, let it be this. Trust is not an unconditional gift. It is a structure that must be constantly maintained and audited. Do not ignore the misplaced mail. Do not brush off the condescending comments. Do not let anyone convince you that your voice no longer matters. If you smell the rot, do not wait for the foundation to collapse. Pick up your scalpel and start cutting. Thank you for listening to my story today. If you found yourself nodding along, or if you know someone who needs to hear this warning about elder fraud and family betrayal, please share this video with them. Leave a comment below and let me know how you would have handled a predator like Julian. I read every single one. And if you want more stories of justice, resilience, and families fighting back, make sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications. Stay vigilant, stay strong, and never let anyone write your final chapter for you.